Hello everyone, welcome to the OpenStack and Beyond podcast. This is your host Shlomo Swidler from Orchestratus on May 4th, 2015. This is a relaunch of the OpenStack Israel podcast, and we'll have some format changes. I'd like to introduce to you my co-host, Nati Shalom of GigaSpaces.
Hey Shlomo, how are you doing these days?
Great, good to have you joining the show, Nati. And our guests today are well known in the IT ecosystem, and we're going to focus on talking about network function virtualization and OpenStack, NFV for short. Before we get into that in detail, Nati, would you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Nati Shalom. I'm CTO and founder of GigaSpaces and been one of the founders of the OpenStack Israel community. Been around for a long time, too long I would say. Some would say, but still enjoying it very much.
Nati, you were one of the first guests on the OpenStack Israel podcasts way back when.
Well,
and
I think you're gonna discover my age this way, but I think it was. When was it? Like 2 or 3 years ago?
It was more than a year ago. I'll have to look back in my history to figure that out. But let's not rehash old times. Let's move forward. On today's show, our guests are, as I said, two wonderful luminaries in the IT ecosystem, Axel Clauberg and Scott Lowe. Scott, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate it. So my name is Scott Lowe. I've been in the industry for a while. I've held a lot of different roles and been in a lot of different spaces. Right now, I'm currently employed by VMware. I work in the Network and Security Business Unit. That's the group that was formed after the acquisition of Nicira, responsible for delivering NSX. I'm a hardcore blogger. Been blogging for about 10 years on Twitter. Usual social media sort of things. Had the wonderful opportunity to write a few books, including last year participating in a OpenStack book sprint on a design and architecture guide. So appreciate the opportunity to be here.
It's great to have you, Scott.
And Axel, I'll let you do the same. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Shalom and good afternoon. My name is Axel Clauberg within Deutsche Telekom's Group CTO team. I'm responsible on one side for the IP architecture and strategy. As part of that, we actually brought in a new concept. We had finally branded it with the name Infrastructure Cloud. That's combining data centers actually very tightly and linking them very tightly with the IP network. And that was actually the starting point of what now became NFV. So I'm on that NFV topic since day one. Before I joined DT, I spent some 13 years at Cisco. And before that, well, starting to work with Unix IP in the early 80s. So yes, I'm quite old already.
So Axel, one question about NFV. I think one question that there's always a question about is NFV is a trend, is that a hype? I know that you've been talking about it for a long time, and all of a sudden it became like an industry trend. What's your view on that?
Well, something in between a hype and slowly becoming reality. I would say when you look at the number of hits you get on Google or Bing or whatever your favorite search engine is, you're above 1 million on NFV. And when you walk around, for example, Mobile World Congress, everyone's talking about NFV. I think the hype indicator is still that only few people actually understand what's behind this and what's needed actually to get it working. And that's what we're currently focusing on, making it reality.
And is that really, from what I understand, mostly driven by economical pressure, right? I mean, it's a technology that is served to actually meet a specific business need for telcos, which is the high cost of the infrastructure itself. Is that a right way to look at that?
Well, on one side, sure, we're addressing production cost, but I think one of the big problems you're seeing in the telco industry is that we're too slow. And it takes a long time to get mass market products out to market. and that's one of the main areas we wanted to address with kind of moving to a software-defined operator principle within DT. That's how I found a new buzzword, software-defined operator, to describe what we are doing. And the main reason is really to be more flexible, to be more open for partnerships, and to also take the benefits out of the software world and take them into the telco world.
And in that context, what kind of new innovation do you see coming because we move to a more virtualized infrastructure?
Oh, well, there's quite some innovation around that. So when you really put virtualized network functions, which are also producing a very high volume of traffic onto your infrastructure, and then the first thing you end up with, you need a network I/O optimized data center. And this network I/O optimized data center, actually, when we look around in the IT world, it didn't exist. So typical IT data centers are in total connected with less capacity to the internet than each of our servers is connected to the internet. So that's a big change to build a network I/O optimized data center. It should be fully automated, so we want to have full automation, we want to have lifecycle orchestration, lifecycle management as you do have in cloud environments. And we want this to be based on open software, on open source software. Open interfaces are really key for us in this new world.
And you're referring to, for those who are less familiar, onto the actual backbone of the telcos. I mean, the actual services that runs the internet today, and not the IT side of the carrier, right?
This is indeed not the IT side of the carrier. When we started the development, we actually thought about well, how can we make best use out of Moore's law, for example. When you look at how services are produced in a telco environment, for example, router vendors are really keen to sell you a service blade into their router. Well, that's great because they are selling it with an obscene margin, and it's good for the vendors. I was on that side. Now, it might not be the best for us. So we came up with that idea, let's make the routers simpler. In order to make the routers simpler, we needed a data center where we could produce services, even very high volume services. For example, in our future architecture, we are running IPv6 only in the core. So we wanted to produce all IPv4 traffic in the data center. And today, it's the majority of the traffic. And that was one of our starting points. But once we had that concept of a data center being a part of the IP infrastructure, then my colleagues who are responsible for carrier core services like IMS, like video, they jumped on the ship and said, well, great, now that we have such a data center, we want to use it as well and simplify our environments, which are fairly complex as well, and shorten the time to market also for these services. And that was the starting point of what later became the ETSI NFV group when we started to share that with the other operators.
Axel, let me ask you a little bit of context here. Since when, how long ago did telco operators change their internal networks to be IP-based?
Well, that's a movement taking, well, I'm not sure. I'm only in the telco industry for 3.5 years, to be honest. And that's the main thing we are definitely driving. No, take, for example, getting rid of PSTN, focusing on IP only. That's a movement you see in the telco industry since the last couple of years, maybe 5+ years.
So it hasn't happened yet.
And yeah, well, in some of our countries we have retired PSTN completely. So if you have IP only, then the next task is, I believe, very simple. You need to optimize your IP production environment, and that's what we are driving here.
Okay, so that's where the parallel, that's where the two industries meet of cloud and telco carriers, where as soon as you're going IP, you're a lot like a data center that a traditional cloud consumer would want to take advantage of.
Right, it's much more similar to the internet companies and the services we are all using as consumers. The production model which was introduced by the big internet companies, and we're adopting that into the telco world.
Hey, Axel, this is Scott here. the depth of experience that you have in working with this is impressive, and so it's very cool to be able to sit here and listen to you talk. I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious. I was wondering, what is your view on the relationship between SDN and NFV? Because I know when I talk to customers, a lot of times those two get confused in their mind. I mean, I think that there is a relationship there, and I have my own thoughts, and I'll share those in a minute. But I was just curious to hear what you think about that.
Oh yeah, well, being active on both sides, also representing DT in the board of the Open Networking Foundation, I'm indeed involved with both, and both are complementary technologies in my point of view, and together they can really help solve a problem with simplifying here the complexity we have in operator environments. Just virtualization alone, when people talk about network function virtualization, hey, let's keep in mind virtualization is a fairly old technology introduced in the 1960s. And yes, we can follow the traditional IT approach and introduce some virtualization in our environment as well. But we actually have to take that forward and take the network into account as well. And here the combination of SDN and NFV is actually the winning one for us.
Yeah, and that mirrors kind of my own perspective on it as well. I mean, you know, virtualization, being able to virtualize workloads is great, but kind of going back to your point earlier of, you know, you need a network I/O optimized data center. You need something that's optimized to pass traffic, because obviously that's core for something like a telco is passing traffic. And you know, until you had the mechanisms to be able to both virtualize the workloads, aka NFV, and be able to optimize and direct traffic through the network in the appropriate way through service chaining or traffic shaping or any of the other mechanisms via SDN, it seems like you really need both to be able to move forward. Absolutely.
So SDN, I think it's like NFV probably. Also, you see a lack of understanding what SDN truly is in the industry. And on one side, that originated at Stanford University, and then we saw all the focus around OpenFlow, but SDN is more than just OpenFlow. So we have the kind of forwarding plane aspects of SDN, but we also have the provisioning and monitoring aspects which come with it as well. And we need to combine actually both in here to make a optimum story together with NFV.
Oh yeah, I agree completely. I mean, you can't ignore the automation aspects of SDN. You know, to your point earlier about all of this needing to be automated, because, you know, let's face it, you guys don't have time, and it's not cost effective for you to have to manually do something when a customer needs a service, right? So we can't ignore the provisioning and the automation aspects and the programmability that SDN can offer. At the same time, you also need service chaining and being able to direct flows when it's appropriate, and then you need the ability to virtualize these workloads in an effective way. So, you know, it's all these pieces coming together, and then of course needing some sort of orchestration tool to help you with that, which, you know, seems to be.
At the same time, we shouldn't let's say come to the ultimate complexity in this picture. So I think service chaining is still a fairly controversial topic. You see in the industry as well. How much service chaining do you need? How far can you address it with simple IP routing?
Axel, I'm going to interrupt you. Can you explain what, just two short sentences on what service chaining is for those who aren't already familiar with it?
So, for example, when you look, it's best to look at a real example. When you look at a mobile network your favorite operator runs, on the way from the core of this mobile network towards the internet, there's a chain of functions which well, the official operator wording would probably be enhance your traffic. And, well, that's, there could be a lot of discussion around that, but let's take that as a fact. Now, as part of that, you might find out that you have a video packet in front of you, and you don't need to check that it's a video packet all the time. You can send a video packet on the video path. And so these would be special paths through your services. You can decide once and then make that forwarding decision much simpler. Now, on the controversy, people say, well, you can do the same with IP routing. So service chaining is kind of a separate path through the network, which might be independent of IP routing.
Okay, so per service channels.
Right. It could be per service, but again, per service, that leads to a thought per flow, and there I have my scalability concerns. So we need to stay focused on delivering a scalable solution.
And Scott, one question on that regard that I think related to both of you. Do you see NFV expanding beyond the carrier themselves into the enterprise?
I tend to think that it is. I mean, I know that the uptake for NFV has been perhaps slower than a lot of people would have liked, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Not the least of which is just the massive investments that companies like Axel's have in their existing infrastructure. But in working with VMware and talking to customers about the enterprise focused NFV type abilities that NSX can offer, there's a lot of uptake there in being able to virtualize DC, enterprise DC focused services. So, less of the telco focused services that Axel's been involved in, more of like, load balancing, firewalling, routing, that kind of thing. Being able to virtualize and distribute that within an enterprise DC offers a lot of value for customers.
And in that context, given that you're coming with the VMware background, I know that VMware has been announcing the VIO integration and that they're moving to OpenStack. Can you elaborate about the motivation behind that move and how is that related to what we're discussing right now?
I'm sorry, you were cutting out there just for a minute. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was asking about the VMware announcement about VIO and how is that related to our topic in your view?
Right. Okay, so VIO, for those that aren't aware, is VMware Integrated OpenStack. It is a distribution of OpenStack, much like you might think of Mirantis offering a distribution of OpenStack or Red Hat offering a distribution of OpenStack. It is a distribution of OpenStack that comes with a support offering from VMware. It's designed to integrate all of VMware's offerings, so you can run your vSphere hypervisors for your compute virtualization. You can use technologies like vSAN or any of the supported storage technologies to provide your storage. You can use NSX to do network virtualization. And just we're trying to make it really, really easy for customers to be able to move into the OpenStack space. We view OpenStack as an option that customers are going to want to embrace, and we want to make sure that we offer customers the ability to make that choice, not just the traditional kind of VMware management platforms, but also being able to say, hey, if you choose instead you would want to use OpenStack, we want to offer the best set of technologies to help you do that.
And Axel, I think you mentioned part of the commitment of NFV is moving to open source and open technologies. How would you view the move to VIO and the support of a company like VMware? Does that change the resistance that I think that I heard before on using something like VMware within the NFV type of activities?
Yeah, a little bit hard to understand, Nati, but I hope I got it. So when we actually put together that architecture, we are now productizing, and we made some thoughts very early on. Do we actually want to bet on single vendors in here, or is that actually too critical for the success of the company? And I think if you would bet on just a single vendor, it would be a very high risk we would run. So we decided very early on to build it actually based on open source. So, for example, KVM is hypervisor, and OpenStack is cloud orchestration framework, and then also some other open source tools around that. And on top of that, we're using Ceph, for example, for distributed storage. So that was a decision we took very early on. Nevertheless, I see the role of the big companies in this community as really critical. Whether it's VMware, whether it's Red Hat, whether it's Canonical, these companies are very important actually because they are the key contributors Sorry, I didn't want to exclude anyone. Mirantis, at whoever your favorite is. So these companies are very important because they are keeping this alive. When you look at the number of commits in the OpenStack, for example, it's quite obvious who keeps the community alive. So these companies are very important. Nevertheless, we don't want to be dependent on a single one of them.
I see. So, so I think the general answer in that case is that it's a fairly positive move in the right direction, and that brings me to the next question that I think we've discussed it, but I also have seen you commenting a lot about it in different chats about the role of orchestration in that world, and I think your comment was that what we're seeing from a lot of vendors is that each network solution provider is now trying to come up with their own orchestration and their own full stack solution, which kind of makes your life as a consumer of those things more complex, because obviously you cannot consume an orchestration per VNF, per network device.
Right. So yeah, I spoke actually a year ago at an event in Chicago. I spoke about the zoo of orchestrators, and if you imagine that each virtualized network function from a vendor, take some of the traditional telco vendors or take newer players in the market, everyone would bring in his own application orchestrator, and then we would have to integrate all of the application orchestrators on top of our distributed OpenStack environment, and this would be an orchestration and management nightmare. The problem is the industry is still in its very early days in this area, and we see some concepts are just, let's say, getting clearer right now. Also some of the tools around that, some of the languages around that, it's getting clearer how we plan to use them, and you see the first products actually hitting the market, but it's still a big debate area. When you look at things like what's the relevance of Yang within the data center. So I believe in the use of Yang. We're using that for our overall real-time network and service management. And for me, it would be ideal to have a Yang-based, consistent approach, also including the data center. But then there are specific languages like Tosca, for example, which maybe make it simpler to address some of the problems because they're tailored for a specific purpose. These domain-specific languages we might see more often. I just don't want a zoo of RESTful interfaces I will all have to serve and maintain. That would be a nightmare for me. So I would prefer, honestly, to have more consistent data models specified, for example, in Yang, which is a very generic schema description language.
I see. I think that we definitely agree on that one, because obviously we share a similar view on the way we look at things, and actually things that putting Tosca and Yang together makes a lot of sense, and that's something that I've learned actually during some of the earlier discussion that I had on that regard, and that's, I think, brings an interesting point on how we, when we start to look at the orchestration and language, kind of jumping ahead here, we start to think of when there is one solution to win them all, and quickly we discover that there is a sweet spot in which one thing can be better than the other, and it actually makes sense to integrate that, and that's part of the maturity cycle in my view. And that kind of brings me, Scott, to you with regard to your view on NSX and the role of NSX in that world. I know that NSX contributed a lot to OpenStack. It actually been the foundation for Neutron when it started. How do you see networking evolving within OpenStack today?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot going on, as you guys are probably well aware, within OpenStack and networking. There's a lot of questions around why, why isn't Neutron as stable or scalable as Nova Network, and there's whole efforts around Nova Network parity for Neutron. I think a lot of that goes back to people's choice to use a plugin that was intended to be a reference example and not an actual usable plugin for anything of any size, and that's the default OVS plugin. But there's work ongoing to address even that through the Open Virtual Network project that the Open vSwitch team is working on. I don't know if you guys have heard about that or not. They just had their first successful end-to-end ping within OpenStack this past week, just a few months after launching the project. And the architecture of that project is intended to help address some of the issues that you see when using the kind of the default plugin. So to give people a good plugin that they can use without having to necessarily go to a commercial network virtualization solution, but obviously those network virtualization solutions like NSX will be there if they need greater scale or greater functionality. I think one of the really interesting things happening in the networking space right now is the idea of intent, so declarative versus imperative configurations, wanting to be able to say this is how we want the network to behave. And then allowing the orchestration layer, Neutron in this case, to then translate that into something that makes sense for the underlying architecture. There's a couple of competing initiatives there and some work going on in Open Daylight as well around that. I'm still on the fence about that. I think that we need a good set of solid logical constructs that we can standardize on before we can start building these higher layers, and right now the solid set of logical constructs is it's limited. It's very enterprise DC focused, and so there isn't a way to orchestrate some of the things beyond a load balancer or VPN as a service or firewalling as a service, and some of those even are still experimental within Neutron. So we still have some work to do to build the foundational basics before we can, in my opinion, start moving up to some of the policy-based approaches.
So speaking of policy-based approaches and fundamental foundational basics, Scott, where do you see containers intersecting with OpenStack and later on NFV?
Yeah, containers are the buzzword of choice these days in the industry. I was just at Interop last week and gave a session on container deployment challenges, and was one of a number of speakers talking about containers, and that was quite the conversation starter. So I think that containers are a great choice for a large number of use cases. I mean, I think there are a number of areas where you need to be able to abstract away some sort of compute workload, and you don't necessarily need the very robust isolation that a traditional hypervisor would offer. Something like a KVM or a Zen or a vSphere. And then that might be for a variety of reasons why you don't need that additional, sort of isolation, right? And because there isn't this robust isolation, they're typically more lightweight. They typically can offer greater density options, and therefore in an environment where density is important and that robust isolation isn't necessarily required, then I think there's a good chance that containers will see a use there. Obviously, within the OpenStack space, containers, kind of fitting containers into Nova isn't quite, it's not quite to the point of trying to put a square peg into a round hole, but it's somewhere along those lines. It's not quite the right fit, and that's why there's been work on this Magnum project, which is intended to offer a container-focused service within OpenStack that will address some of those slight discrepancies between Nova, which is obviously very VM-focused, and containers, which, while similar to VMs, have some differences. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses. It's very, very early yet, but it will be interesting to see how it evolves. And I think there will be a greater role for containers in the data center, both enterprise data centers and in telco data centers, such as the one that Axel is building.
Cool, Axel. What do you foresee with that?
Yeah, I second that view. I think it's still early days. You see some in the telco industry who are over enthusiastic on containers. Well, I'm somewhere in the middle there. It's a valuable tool, but it's part of the toolbox, and indeed we need to integrate it properly and this will still require quite some work as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Axel's view. Containers are a useful tool, but they are not going to solve every problem. It's just one more option that organizations have to address, the needs that they're going. It'll be used in conjunction with orchestration tools, in conjunction with, quote unquote traditional virtualization, and all the rest of the things that we're using today.
It's actually quite amazing, Shlomo. I think we all been experiencing the tsunami in the cloud world and how fast technology change and people move to new technologies, and containers in a way is a very interesting disruption, because I think that's the technology that I found moving from disruption to commodity in a way in the fastest cycle I ever seen. So in a period of 2 years, I think it started from a disruption, now it's becoming more common. So it's interesting to see that dynamic in general in the industry itself, and in my view, I think one of the things that we need to adapt to is that the only constant is change. I mean, that whatever we design today is probably going to change tomorrow, and therefore the design assumption wouldn't be how do we just create a stable environment. It needs to be how do we create an environment that is stable to adopt change, which sounds like a contradiction in a way, or oxymoron if you like. But that's becoming the reality, and Docker is definitely a good example for that.
Yeah, in fact, I had a conversation with a customer a couple of months ago. They have not yet adopted cloud, but they already want to move to containers.
Well, they move, they skip one generation.
Well, it actually makes sense because it's much easier to map an application to a container than it is to a cloud necessarily. And as long as you're willing to make that change, you may as well go to the container-specific or container-centric approach.
Yeah, it sounds like, speaking of telco, I mean, it sounds like the same thing that happened in Africa when they, skipped the landline in a way into mobile and then into satellite because of the, so it might be the case here as well.
Well, to speak with Einstein, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not any simpler. I think it's indeed a learning curve we're going through, and sure, mobile for Africa doesn't solve all the problems, and containers for us don't solve all the problems we have. So, very simple.
Yeah, definitely don't need to convince me on that. That brings me back to you, Axel, with regard to the choice of OpenStack. I know that when NFV started, it wasn't that clear that OpenStack is going to be the platform, and ETSI as if you like, a generic term that doesn't use OpenStack for describing its infrastructure. How did OpenStack become the infrastructure for NFV? Maybe you're the best person maybe to describe that, given that. Yeah.
Well, I think in the beginning there was indeed a big debate on what the cloud orchestration framework should be. And OpenStack was just one of the options. It was the one we betted on, and it seems there was a large enough mass of people behind that, and I think you're also seeing here a problem in the way telcos are dealing with open source overall. So telcos typically had in the past the self-understanding, we go into a community and present our requirements and someone will implement that. Now it's a little bit different, as we all know, in the open source world, and I think what happened in OpenStack that indeed a lot of contributors were focusing around the problems the telcos were actually raising. Some telcos did contribute some things as well, and all of a sudden there was enough momentum and it could happen. It was a painful journey for us as well, and still there are some things which are not working as I would like them to work, but I think it's a great community and we're seeing great progress on the journey, so I'm happy with that decision.
So maybe you could describe a little bit how you're using OpenStack today, which version, size, things that you can obviously disclose. I'm sure that not everything can be disclosed.
Yeah, well, we're currently running based on Icehouse, and we have one OpenStack instance per data center, so we're running distributed data centers. Probably we never disclose the nitty-gritty details of our environment for well, obvious reasons. We want to have a competitive leader as well. Apologies for not stepping into great detail, but iSaaS was a major step forward for us, and obviously closely watching what's currently happening around Kilo, and I would assume that this is a next step we would implement, but it's too early to comment right now. I think one of the big problems we had to address was definitely how we install and how we maintain this. So we developed some things around that together with our partners, and we're making good progress there. So.
And what about IPv6? I mean, was it difficult to implement IPv6 within OpenStack, or did you have to make any tweaks for that?
Indeed, when we started with Folsom, yes, that was a difficult journey. Sure, over time we have more and more v6 support within OpenStack. iSaaS was, well, it was not completely painless, but it was controllable pain. Sure, we were expecting that with Kilo that support, which was added in a couple of key components, would be as complete as we needed. But again, with iSaaS, it's runnable. We're, as mentioned in our new architecture, we're fully betting on IPv6 because it's a management nightmare to carry all the v4 private addressing with you. So it's a much cleaner approach to build a new world based on v6.
Excellent. So again, maybe Shlomo, you wanted to jump in?
There's the unmute button. Yeah. So I was wondering, Axel, if you could give us a little bit of a feel for how long it'll take for NFV adoption to actually affect things that telco customers experience.
Actually, you start to see this now. During Mobile World Congress, we had launched the first product, actually for business customers, produced on that platform. That was a Cloud VPN product. We launched in 3 of our countries, Slovakia, Hungary, and Croatia. And, well, VPN sounds like a boring old product, but here we introduced self-service capabilities, and customers can enhance their product, simple VPN service with web security, antivirus protection, firewalls, and intrusion prevention. So customers can combine that, can define their package, and also add mobile users, whatever they want on the fly. So that's the first product, and customers start to see the benefits actually of moving to such a software-based production model. And sure, for mainstream adoption, until all the services are produced in a large operator, it will take a couple of years. So we're going to make some steps in that direction. You're going to see probably more announcements from other operators also over the course of this year. Because what's currently happening in the operator industry is, in the telco industry, is that we are taking things into production. And so customers will see more and more of that over the next years.
Excellent. Maybe as we starting to conclude here, let's get back to the OpenStack Kilo release and what's coming up in the summit, since we are under the OpenStack community podcast here. So I'll start again with you, Axel. What's in your view? You mentioned that there are a couple of announcements that you're waiting for in Kilo. Can you be more specific about what's exciting for you, or what are the things that you're waiting for in Kilo, in the new OpenStack Kilo release?
You finally caught me on not knowing all the details. So to be more precise, I'm more on the political side these days. So
okay.
Trusting my team, what they told me, on one side, sure, the great work which went into heat. It's important what we see on the completion of the IPv6 support. These are the important pieces. Also on the Neutron side, a lot of progress made there. But this one caught me really. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. We didn't prepare that question, so just probably my problem. What about you, Scott?
So I'm not necessarily as familiar with some of the specific changes. I keep a broad view of what's going on in the industry, and within OpenStack specifically. But the key things that I'm looking at and watching, obviously, we're continuing to make good progress with Neutron overall in terms of scalability, in terms of feature support. So improved layer 3 HA, improved DVR functionality. Sorry, DVR, not digital video recorder, as some people would think. Distributed virtual router. So distributed routing, which is a key traffic optimization. So it's nice to see continued improvements there, and as Axel mentioned, continued improvements in IPv6 support throughout.
And what do you think should be the focus of OpenStack? I mean, are you happy with the way it's evolving, or you have your specific view on where it should focus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I want to say that I support the idea of and not just the idea, but the actual community that we work together to drive features and development of this project to benefit as many people as possible. And obviously, you go back to that old saying, you can't please all the people all the time, right? So whatever decision you make in terms of what feature should or should not be prioritized or should not be added, you'll end up, somebody will be unhappy about it, and that's just you do the best you can, right? But overall, I mean I'm reasonably pleased with how things are going. I think that so I like what's going on with Open Virtual Network as a way to bolster kind of the way that Neutron works. So that's good stuff, and that'll bring some great container-specific networking functionality into OpenStack if everything goes according to the way the community is driving that right now, which will then enable us to do some multi-tenancy at a container level, for example, which I think is going to be important. I want to continue to see how Magnum, which is the container project that I mentioned earlier, evolves, whether that gets rolled into Nova or stands on its own. There's kind of people who want to see it go both ways, so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. But overall, we're making good progress. Would it be nice to go faster? Sure, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we're taking our time and doing it right.
Yeah, that's a good point about Magnum. I'm clear about that. Shlomo?
Yeah, Axel, I was wondering what your wish list from OpenStack is.
So, well, obviously, there are a couple of topics on the table which were brought up in the telco working group as part of the OpenStack community. So, ideally, all of that would come true in future releases. I think specifically high availability is a key requirement actually for us moving forward, and that still requires a lot of work. Let's say I don't want to stretch that old wording around carrier grade too much, because carrier grade might be seen as something negative, but we have to offer in our distributed production environment a very high availability. So running OpenStack itself in the HA setup is definitely key for us. The maintainability of OpenStack is sure a problem for many telcos as well, and we're still running at a very high feature velocity with also new features which are added to OpenStack, luckily. But it turns more and more problem if you take virtualized network functions on top of that environment into production. You need to maintain the OpenStack environment underneath. Sure, there are various approaches to do so. A couple of the distributions have added their specific way of handling it. We see the OpenStack and OpenStack approach, and I think this will still require some focus moving forward.
Right. I have a kind of another concluding question, if I may, for both of you.
You may.
Do you think that it would be better for OpenStack to embrace Amazon and maybe Google, or should it, position itself or continue to position itself as an alternative approach?
Embracing a giant is very difficult, I would say, and both are definitely a giant in this space. So I think there's a benefit. Taking some developments which are happening in this Amazon or Google world, some things will be taken one by one. Some things will be adjusted and improved. So I see an advantage also of staying a little bit independent, not just blindly following that, because by the end it would all be a very boring world if everyone would do the same.
Yeah, that's Scott. What do you think?
Yeah, so you asked that question. I'm thinking, wow, we're really going to go for some controversy here, huh? There's
that was the intent, by the way.
That was the intent. Okay, that's fair enough. Well, you succeeded. There's a lot of discussions and stuff back and forth around, whether OpenStack should embrace AWS APIs and that sort of thing. So I think the right thing to do, if we're going to say OpenStack is an open source project, driven by the community with governance by the foundation and all the things that we have built and stated around OpenStack, right? That it has to be the community that drives it. Naturally, we can look to organizations like AWS or GCE or any of the vendors who are contributing and any of the technologies they're creating for possible ideas of what would be useful. But really what we need to focus on is, and I don't know if there's necessarily been enough focus on this, but what we really need to focus on is, are we building the best product that actually solves the problems that our users have, right? We need to make sure that we don't get caught off in the kind of the new shiny, if you will, like, oh, that's cool, let's go do this, but let's focus on making sure that OpenStack is the best platform it can be to solve the problems that OpenStack users want and need it to solve, right? I think there's room within the open source community and even within the OpenStack community for organizations who need compatibility with AWS, for example, or whose customers need compatibility with AWS, to be able to say, we're going to contribute back and do that. Now, whether that is, I just don't think that needs to be necessarily a core part of the projects of the overall charter of OpenStack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, specifically given that VMware was considered, even though contribution to NSX, a rival to OpenStack for a long time, and there's been different discussion about PayPal and other debates about that, and now it's embracing OpenStack, and that's kind of brought me to the idea that maybe the right way to look at other clouds is embracing them rather than look at them as a rival in a way. So I was thinking also actually on the opposite direction, rather than having OpenStack supporting the AWS API. I think that's been the very best approach for that. Actually encouraging the giants in different ways, and I think there are ways to that to support OpenStack, or maybe create tools that will, have OpenStack API as a way to access those other clouds. That's another direction that I think might be in that. And again, the idea was that if VMware made that move, why not look at the other clouds in that space?
Yeah, and I think that's a just to be completely honest here, I think that's a great ideal, right? I just don't know that it'll ever actually happen. Right? Yeah. Maybe I'm being pessimistic, and if so, I apologize. But I think that my perspective on it is that those of us in the community, let's focus on contributing back. Let's focus on fixing the problems that OpenStack has. Let's focus on driving it forward to be the best platform that it can be to solve the needs of the users who are actually deploying OpenStack today. As the project gains, kind of a user base, then we gain the ability to potentially influence some of these other, other clouds, right? To say, what can we do to promote interoperability? What can we do to promote, you know, is a matter of, you know, us taking our OpenStack APIs, which are, you know, essentially an open standard, although they haven't gone through a standards body, but are an open standard because they're implemented in the open, and letting you implement those so that, you know, users get this? Is it a matter of, you know, driving another project which maybe not is central to it, but gives an API compatibility layer? You know, there's obviously a lot of different ways to handle that. But I think that before we can get to that point, we first have to focus on, you know, the core issues that stand in front of OpenStack today. You know, upgrades, maintainability, ease of installation and deployment, scalability in certain areas, visibility, et cetera, et cetera.
Fair point. Axel, did you want to add anything about it?
Well, not much to add, honestly. No, I think pretty much everything was said.
Excellent. So I think that at least Shlomo, if just still another question.
I do have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So we have on this call, obviously Axel representing Deutsche Telekom, and Scott, unofficially, you could say, wearing a VMware hat. So if I were to offer you, Scott, the opportunity to make a pitch to Axel to buy VMware for their NFV cloud, what would you say?
Well, first I would preface that by saying I'm actually not wearing a VMware hat. I prefer not to wear a VMware hat, but
right,
you know,
unofficial.
Instead, unofficially, I instead prefer just to be a member of the community and contribute in a way that drives the entire community forward. So that being said, if I were meeting with Axel and we were talking about NFV, you know, one of the key benefits that I think VMware can offer in one aspect of NFV, and that is the compute virtualization. You know, while KVM is a great hypervisor, I think there are still some functionalities potentially that vSphere could offer, depending on how you wanted to architect it, that would allow you to potentially see some benefits for how you virtualize the workloads. And you could potentially do that in a way that still doesn't necessarily compromise a multi-vendor strategy, right? Internally, and I don't know how many people know this, internally within the Network and Security Business Unit at VMware, we actually run a multi-hypervisor OpenStack cloud that has both vSphere and KVM, and we use that for internal testing and stuff. And this has helped us also consult with customers and provide information to customers who want to run a multi-hypervisor OpenStack cloud. So I think there may be some benefits there. Obviously, we're very bullish on what we can do with NSX, but you know, that's us, right? So there you go.
Axel, what do you think?
Yeah, well, where can I sign? No, joking aside.
Yeah, and where do I get my commission?
We're obviously analyzing what's happening in the industry and having also good contact to VMware. Nevertheless, we're following a slightly different strategy in how we're building our environment right now, but that doesn't exclude VMware in any way for the future.
So
that's good to hear, Axel. Thanks.
So maybe kind of to conclude the discussion here, I wanted to throw a forward-looking question in a way about networking and application in general, and where do you see that going? And the question is really, we've seen a movement towards DevOps, where basically we gave developers access to infrastructure, and we've seen the revolution that it created. All of a sudden, we got developer developing directly into the infrastructure, getting application right into production, and things on that line, and that changed the entire way we think of IT and operation, etc. Networking has similar potential, meaning that now we're giving a developer access to networking. So it's not just automating, you know, the manual stuff. It's giving developer access to networking, which means that they can do a lot of things directly without going through a moderated network as we used to. It doesn't have to go through the operator to actually create the network and do those types of things. There's obviously an advantage to that. There is a risk that comes with that. What do you think about that? Do you see networking go beyond automation into creating something that will be similar to DevOps from a cultural perspective, from the opportunity perspective? I'll start with you, Axel.
Yeah, sure. We're seeing that kind of a DevOps model is currently adopted to the telco world. because you can't obviously translate it one-to-one, but because this is indeed critical infrastructure, and if you mess up, you might just kill your whole infrastructure with it. So I think for us, it's indeed a cultural journey. It's a major transformation hitting the telco industry. The telco industry, for a large extent, is still working in kind of waterfall mode, and moving to this more agile mode, changing responsibilities, bringing teams together which were separated in separate silos. That is the first step into making DevOps reality on the operator side here in our telco world.
Great. And Scott?
Yeah, so I think that there is going to be a change in networking. I think that it's the pressure, so to speak, of all these other industries which have moved forward in so many ways in terms of automation and management and orchestration that just simply hasn't happened on the networking space. I think there's enough pressure that we are going to see a change. If you look at how technologies or methodologies, rather, such as DevOps, have evolved, they still evolved within a set of controls that allow sort of a cleaner consumer provider abstraction, right? So you look at somebody who is using DevOps tools and methodologies to deploy applications onto Amazon. They don't have access to the operation behind the scenes, but they can consume capacity in some predefined ways. And I think that's probably the direction we're going to see networking go. I don't know that we're going to see networking go to the realm, and this is kind of Axel's point, in that you have this critical infrastructure. You can't just say, hey, sure, automate the core switch that affects 10,000 users or whatever. That's probably not going to be it, right? But I think you will see an evolution towards a cleaner consumer provider model where application developers or consumers, whatever that looks like, will be able to consume network capacity, network connectivity, and network services, and do that in a way that leverages some of the same sorts of DevOps methodologies and DevOps tools that you're seeing on the compute side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Shlomo?
Very much. Makes a lot of sense. Gentlemen, it seems we've come to the end of our show. Axel, Scott, thank you for joining us. We are going to leave you at this point. I'd like to just remind everybody that we'll stay tuned for upcoming episodes. And the OpenStack Israel event is going to be coming up in Tel Aviv on June 15th. Don't miss it, although you have my advanced apologies for having to miss it myself. But gentlemen, again, thank you for joining us. Great show. We look forward to seeing you around the cloud.
And Axel, we're looking forward to seeing you in Israel, actually.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to that as well. Toda Rabba.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Shem.
Thanks,
guys.
Bye-bye.